Paul A. Kramer, in his book The Blood of Government, discusses the American occupation and colonization of the Philippines. While most histories of the subject almost exclusively focus on American actors and American motivations, Kramer utilizes a trans-historical and world historical framework to shed new light on the nuances of this scenario. Whereas many histories treat the Filipinos as mere subjects being acted upon, Kramer examines the ways in which Filipinos were themselves agents in the historical process. In utilizing these frameworks, Kramer's primary focus is upon the ways in which race formation affected all parties, and he does so with aplomb. One of the key ways that Kramer initiates the transhistorical method is how he begins his book. Rather than initially focusing on McKinley or Roosevelt or the Spanish-American War, as most histories of the subject do, Kramer focuses upon Spanish imperialism on the islands and the early foundations of Filipino nationalism. There seems to be a consistent trend of anti-colonial nationalists coming from highly educated middle and upper class persons, doctors, lawyers, teachers, many of which were, ironically, educated in the colonial metropole. For instance, Gandhi received his law degree from University College London. Pol Pot attended a college in Paris. Kramer demonstrates that this trend remained much the same with nationalists in the Philippines. Many Filipino intellectuals gained their education and credentials from universities in Spain. Many of these ilustrados, using their education, lobbied, wrote, and fought for an imagined community of Filipinos. One of these early nationalists, Jose Rizal, noted that, quote, "Abroad, the inhabitants of the most distant provinces seal their patriotic feeling," unquote. Yet, the construction of this Filipino nation was itself influenced strongly by Spanish racial politics. For decades, the Philippines were considered a racial other in the Spanish Empire. Other Spanish colonies were allowed legislative representation. The Philippines alone were excluded from this privilege. A key aspect of Ilustrado activism was to convince the metropole that Filipinos were much the same as the Spanish. Yet this Filipino had to be constructed by the Ilustrados. Filipino almost exclusively applied to the Hispanicized and Christianized segments of the islands, as well as a racial myth of good Malay migration. Those who were not descended from the Malays, those who were Muslim or animist, or those who were not culturally connected to Spain were not considered Filipino. In this regard, the Ilustrados were engaging in a racialized nationalist project, a division that would persist for decades afterwards. When attempts at recognition did not bear fruit, these early nationalists switched gears towards full independence for the islands. In so doing, the Ilustrados racialized the Spanish and claimed that they were fundamentally different from the Filipino, a tit for tat. While this racial struggle was occurring in the Pacific, the United States was engaging in its own racialized imperial struggles against Native American tribes. By 1890, the frontier was officially closed. While it was a celebrated victory, it also posed a problem for many American leaders. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner argued that a key aspect of American identity and culture was the existence of the frontier. Much of the nation's self-conceptualization and raison d'etre was tied to the frontier that now no longer existed. This anxiety, combined with the fear of industrial capitalism causing a loss of masculinity, could be seen as reasons for expanding beyond the continent, ever westward, beyond the shining sea. Many American leaders, especially Teddy Roosevelt, were adamant expansionists, both for the sake of American identity, but also in competition with old Europe. How could the Empire of Liberty bear the thought that the tyrannies of Europe bestrode most of the world. The tragedy of the USS Maine presented an interesting opportunity for American expansionists. The ailing Spanish Empire was an ideal target. The Spanish-American War was also a great opportunity for both Cuban and Filipino nationalists. Filipino leaders operating in exile in Hong Kong beseeched for the Americans to help remove the yoke of the Spanish. Technological limitations, bureaucratic faux pas, unclear diplomatic instructions, and conflicting visions led to the United States sending Filipino nationalists extremely mixed messages. Arguably, these miscommunications would plant seeds for future conflict. Suffice it to say, the United States itself had a very mixed proposals for what should happen to the Philippines after the war. Two camps clearly formed, often crossing party lines: imperialists and anti-imperialists. What is significant, though, both sides disagreed on imperial policy, but they both agreed on a racialized framework. The question of race would be foundational for these debates, as well as how the Philippines were administered. For many imperialists, Filipinos were racially inferior and thus required tutelage and self-governance. It would be irresponsible, so they said, to let their little brown brothers free into the world unprepared. Further, as the imperialists claimed, there was no genuine Filipino nation, but rather an assortment of tribes and clans with varying degrees of savagery. If the Americans left too early, the animists and Muslims would be direly oppressed. All signs pointed to the necessity of American empire for the benefit of the Philippines. For many anti-imperialists, the picture was reversed. There was a dire fear that imperial projects directly contradicted American traditions of republicanism and individual liberty. It was a hypocritical goal, given that the United States itself had fought for independence from a colonial metropole. For Americans to be masters of foreigners would contradict the essence of America. What point is there in competing in a game created by the European tyrants? While these sentiments were often high-minded, they were often paired with a crass racism. Many anti-imperialists also believed that Filipinos were racially inferior, and therefore it was imperative for Americans to distance themselves. It was widely believed that whites visiting and living in tropical environments degenerated, both morally and racially. Further, if the Philippines became a territory, it would allow for unimpeded Filipino migration. This would directly contradict decades of prior legislation that barred Southern and Eastern Asians from immigration, groups who were declared to be incapable of citizenship. Yet, the Philippines would represent a direct contradiction to these policies, a gap in the dam holding back the yellow peril. Such migration would lead to miscegenation and racial degeneration. Thus, one can see the importance of the racial question to these debates. Neither side actually disagreed on the framework of racial differences and hierarchies. What they disagreed on was how to best implement these hierarchies. Yet this was not merely a dialogue amongst Americans. Filipinos were also active participants and lent their voices in a variety of ways. There was an immediate disagreement about how to approach the new American managers. Some Filipinos opted for violence, a continuation of the struggles against the Spanish, but redirected to a new target. But even amongst those who used violence, there were disagreements. Emilio Aguinaldo, for instance, wanted to move quickly in declaring independence so that he could circumvent his own political rivals. Other Filipinos opted for collaboration and a longer timeline for independence. In the end, those collaborators ended up with a great deal more influence than the revolutionaries. A key way in which Filipino elites, those same highly educated professionals, collaborated with the Americans was a form of racialization. On one hand, accepting the American framing of race as well as adding their own variants. For one, many Filipinos tried to demonstrate the value of their civilization using a Eurocentric frame. They emphasized their Christianity, their education, their modern science, their literature, their architecture. Conversely, Filipinos continued their racialization of non-Christians. Arguably, these were the same approaches that the Ilustrados took with the Spanish decades earlier. Furthermore, by accepting that the American authorities were the arbiters of self-governance and civilization, the collaborators were essentially buying in to the American racial conception. It would be dubious to say that Kramer's book is a history of the Philippines or a history of the U.S. It is a history of both, and goes to great lengths to examine the ways in which both agents affected each other. Kramer does a magnificent job in shedding light on new avenues of the scenario. Too often, Filipinos are treated by historians as mere subjects, but Kramer is clear in that they were part of the imperial dialogue. Conceptions of race, in particular, were a key part of this imperial dialogue. Kramer does a magnificent job in demonstrating how every side of the matter engaged in racialization of perceived others.